Heidi Hanna, welcome back to Paper Napkin Wisdom. Thanks for joining me.
Thanks for having me back.
Well, it was actually, this was a really fun paper napkin that you're going to share with everyone listening, because we actually came up with it when you did your first napkin.
That's right, we did. It was a joint effort, so you should get co-credit on this. You're my co-author.
Highly doubtful, but I'll take any credit I can get. So that's good. So why don't we describe it? Can you just describe it for everyone who's listening?
Absolutely. Well, I'll start with the background of what we were talking about, because I think that matters to why this particular aha moment came up. And that is, we were talking about energy and the fact that energy is your most valuable resource. And that, I sit on airplanes all the time, as I know you do, and probably a lot of your listeners do. And I hear the flight attendants say the safety, talk that they always give in the beginning, talking about putting your oxygen mask on first and how important that is. Yet, most of us kind of multitask our way through that announcement and we're not really paying attention. And on this particular day, it just really hit me that it's not about being selfish, but really, truly, we can't help the people around us if we're not taking care of our most important resources. And to me, through my research, through my, both personal and professional experiences, I've learned that that comes down to energy. How can you show up in the moments that matter most? And so we were having a conversation about that. And I think I must have gone into a little bit about my background as a softball pitcher. And so we were having this conversation about how athletes recognize that there's a certain window in which they can perform at optimal levels. So some people have probably heard of the Human Performance Institute, where I was really blessed to work for 8 years and learn from Jim Laird and Jack Groppel on kind of the science of high performance, or the biology of high performance. And so most of that research was done in sports, looking at how elite performers in sports find ways to recharge their energy in short periods of time. So looking at tennis, for example, in between plays, what does the tennis player do to restore their energy so that they can come back up to that high level again? And in fact, I was reading today that in tennis, for example, I can't remember the exact statistic, but it's something like they're only playing 35% of the time that they're on the court. The rest of the time, they're figuring out how to restore and recharge their energy so that it's at this high level. So as you and I were talking about that, I mentioned that I went to college on a softball scholarship and I was a softball pitcher. And that we were limited in regards to how many games we could play, or essentially a pitch count. So, in sports, we know that there's a limitation to the amount of energy we can exert in that peak performance state. And so learning to oscillate is incredibly critical in athletics, but it's also really important for business. And I think even more so, looking at business, looking at our whole entire life, understanding that just nature, the way that we're designed to oscillate. We're designed to have periods of highs and periods of lows, and that can feel really uncomfortable. In fact, I just did a blog about learning to surf, and that was the analogy I was using for understanding if you're going to take your energy to extraordinarily high levels, you have to bounce back. You have to compensate for that somehow, or you risk burning out. And so that's become my focus right now in the new book I'm working on, Recharge, is what is it that we can do in the real world outside of sports that helps us to restore our energy to high levels so that we can go back onto the playing field, whatever that might be, whether it's in the boardroom or it's at home. How do we transition home so that we can show up to the best of our ability? And so as you and I were talking about that concept of a pitch count, I thought, okay, this really hits home for me. I have maxed out on my pitch count. I can see how exhausted I am, and I keep trying to get recovery and I keep trying to recharge, but I'm not doing it effectively enough. So I know that I still need to get a better sense of what that pitch count is, and then how I restore my energy so I can go back into the game at a really high level.
Yeah, and you know what's really, and I think it's really important that you set it up in that way, because it really does, tie into where the pitch count came from so neatly. And I think it's really important to recognize that the pitch count is something that is imposed upon the pitcher, right?
That's true.
There isn't a pitcher in the world that I can think of that stands on a mound and says, "Oh, I'm at 100 pitches.
Right.
I gotta go. and they're right in the middle of something big, and they've got two people on base, and the pressure's on, and they say, okay, that's it, toss in the towel, I'm done.
Yeah.
No one signs up for that. It's imposed upon them, and it flies in the face of this really basic, I think, and I wonder about the fictitiousness of this belief that balance actually even exists. And instead of
No.
it being about seasons, you talked about the hills and the valleys, and I think it's really about understanding that there are peaks and valleys. If you're going to give yourself to something,
Yeah.
as entrepreneurs, as leaders, we have to give ourselves to that thing. But that
Yeah.
also means that we have to get out. And maybe we're not the best person to figure that out as to when to get out.
I think that brings up a really good point. I think you're right in understanding that, a pitch count in sports, someone determined, what the number is where we start to see more injuries. And so there was always this thought that as a softball pitcher, because it's underhand, we could throw more innings because it was a more natural motion. Well, yeah, that, I guess if you're looking at my shoulder socket, maybe, but there's a lot of other things that go into that. I mean, I look back at all of the stress that I was under as a pitcher in peak situations, and not saying that that's bad, because stress is good. But there is a point, and we see this on the stress performance curve, where the level of stress starts to deteriorate our ability to be resilient. So stress initially stimulates us and causes us to adapt and causes us to become stronger. But over time, we see that start to weaken. So in my mind, what I'm thinking around this pitch count idea is that it's really ultimately up to each of us to determine what our pitch count is and to become more aware of how we know when we're reaching that point where maybe we've been in too many innings. What are the signs and symptoms that start to show up for you? So I know for me, for example, last year was the first time I've ever started experiencing headaches. And, they weren't debilitating, but it was just kind of in the front of my forehead. I would feel this kind of low level headache, and I would take a step back and realize that was my body's first way of saying, you got too much going on right now. Your brain's working too hard and you're not going to be able to sustain that. But we now recognize all of those things as being quote unquote normal. Everyone has headaches, everyone has stress, everyone has problems sleeping, everyone drinks too much, everyone takes sleeping pills, everyone uses caffeine. I mean, there's this long list of things that we're doing to tolerate life, as opposed to figuring out, what is the rhythm that I need? How many pitches can I make? How many days can I be on the road? How many meetings can I take? For me, the easiest example I can give is figuring out how to do a 50-minute work hour. I think just naturally, one easy thing that we can do is start to schedule blocks shorter than what we actually usually do, because we schedule everything on the hour and then we have no time to transition. We have no downtime built in. So it's figuring out, I know I can be more fully engaged for 50 minutes with you or with a client or whatever it may be if I know that I have a 10-minute downtime coming. And then learning what is it during that 10-minute downtime that I can do to maximize that recharge process.
Yeah, and I think you nailed that really well in the sense of identifying what that is, maybe setting up a rhythm around maintaining that energy balance, and the balance not really being a balance, but it's being about being forcefully engaged in one direction and then forcefully engaged in another. And that forceful engagement is part of it. Unplugging for 10 minutes doesn't mean surfing the internet. That's not
Exactly.
really recharging your battery, is it?
Exactly. And that is such an important point, because I think what happens is when we start to really get burnt out, that's exactly what we turn to. We turn to things that kind of numb us out for a while, but essentially add more stress. And I find that in myself even right now as I'm trying to get myself going for the new year, is I feel I crave kind of like reality TV and just garbage that is a way for me to kind of numb out. But ultimately, when that show's over, I'm more stressed because now I just lost time and I didn't get any sort of benefit from it. So, and I'm not saying that there isn't a time and place for just vegging out, but in those moments, it's all really about being intentional, right? So we intentionally focus our full and best energy for a period of time, and then we intentionally disengage. So it's periods of strategic engagement with periods of strategic disengagement, and creating that rhythm or that heartbeat, so to speak.
Yeah, so if we're thinking about it as a heartbeat, if we're thinking about it as a pulse, or something that we have to maintain, what are the things that we can do, or what are the things that you've done, Heidi, to look at yourself going backwards? And you've talked about these chronic things, these headaches, lack of sleep, that kind of thing. But I'm not really someone who suffers a lack of sleep problem. I mean,
Oh, good.
it doesn't bother me. And I think it's because when I was young, my parents introduced me to meditation and breathing exercises, and I've always done it on some level. So I think that's there, and I'm able to relax. But what are the things that we can look at and pay attention to check our own pitch count? And because again, I maintain that I'm never going to take myself out when the bases are loaded, and I've got to get this out at the plate. I want to be the one who does that, and I want my peak energy there.
Right.
I don't have it.
Right.
I've got to be off.
Well, what's interesting is that's that proactive effort that you make to be at your peak when it matters most. And that's something most people don't think about, is we just go and go and go and go and assume that it will be there. But if we know what matters most to us and we can really focus in on that, that helps us start to create the plan for how to really recharge our energy most effectively. Is first of all looking at, what does matter most to me, and kind of giving ourselves time and space to reflect on that. So for me, for example, it really is when I go out on my speaking engagements and I'm connecting with clients. So when I'm home and I feel stir crazy because I'm not in the moment, in the game, so to speak, I can wear myself out just spinning about stuff that's not important, instead of really building in that as my recharge time. So I now know that when I travel and sleep is changing and I have high levels of energy, that it requires a certain, maybe 2 or 3 days to fully recover. Now, that doesn't mean I do nothing for 3 days, but I start to watch my patterns to see, when do I need more sleep? When can I get a massage? Can I spend more time in nature? I think it's knowing that when we do create time to recharge, we have a toolbox of things to go to that are going to help us. So I think the first thing is to really connect with what's most important so that we can understand when we want to capitalize that peak performance the most. Another thing that I just started doing is asking people to do an energy audit. So this just looks at the 5 things during the day that I consider to be the most important recharge data points, so to speak. So I'll have someone look at these 5 things. And we mentioned the first one already, and that is sleep. I actually start the night before and have people write down what time they typically go to sleep. Then also what time they typically wake up. So you're bookending your day with these 2 really important moments. The first one is, how do you prepare yourself for sleep? Are you giving yourself enough time to sleep? It should be at least 7 to 8 hours for most people. But also, how are you preparing your brain to get adequate sleep? Do you have healthy sleep hygiene, we call it? So habits that you use to wind down. Are you staying away from technology at least an hour or 2 before bed? Those sorts of things. So that would be the first point, is what I call bedtime prep time. The second thing is morning rituals. So what are you doing first thing in the morning? Are you putting something positive into your brain, or are you starting off in survival mode? So a lot of people check email, watch the news, read the paper, browse the internet, and there's much more negative than positive information going into the brain. So that automatically sets us into survival mode, which is going to cause more wear and tear. The opposite of that then is to be strategic and focused about morning, the first 30 minutes when you wake up, having a morning ritual. And as you know, Warren Rustand, a good friend of ours, talks about read, write, think as his ritual. I have what I call my high 5, where I get movement, mindfulness, motivation, meditation, and mirth, which is humor. So like whatever it is that works for you, have something that you go to every day to get yourself into the right state of mind. And then the 3 key points kind of throughout the day are going to be nutrition, movement, and rest. So how are you fueling your body? Maybe sleep isn't an issue, but maybe you go longer than 3 or 4 hours during the day without eating. That is a crash point from an energy perspective. When you do eat, making sure it's balanced, those sorts of things. Movement is the 4th one, and that's just making sure you're getting up and moving regularly, because we know if you sit for long periods of time, your system down from an energy perspective. And then the last thing, which is great that you said you trained on this from an early age, most people don't take time or make the effort to turn off their mind, to practice some sort of mindfulness, meditation, relaxation, deep breathing. There's a lot of ways to do that. But to me, I'll just work with each person individually and say, okay, draw a line on a piece of paper, morning to night. what does your rhythm currently look like, and where might you be missing points that you could be recharging your energy. And then the last thing is what we talked about earlier, which is just knowing your signs, knowing your symptoms, starting to understand what your pitch count is, and trying to identify the quiet messages that your system sends you to say something's not quite right before you actually start breaking down. Is it the little headache? Is it lack of sleep? Is it a change in your appetite? Is it being more irritable? Just feeling more tension? All of those things are subtle signs that you're out of what we call balance, knowing that balance isn't really balance, it's integration or it's oscillation. There's going to be ups and downs to it, but at some point, if that pulse starts to get where you're not getting enough recovery for the amount of stress that you have, that's where you're going to see those symptoms of imbalance.
That's awesome. And one of the things that I really think is really important to take away from your 5 points that you talked about is this notion that it's a plan. It is entering into the day with intention to make sure that we're able to give ourselves forcefully, to be wholly in every moment, and not letting something else come back from some fatigue from the past hold us back from being in that peak performance state right now. And that's what ends up happening, isn't it? The payoff. So we talked about the downsides of not managing your energy buckets and making sure that those are full. But the payoff is, if you do these things, if we enter the day with a plan and with intention, when the push comes to shove and we need to be our best, we have it in the tank to be there.
That's exactly right. And I think what the pitch count brings us back to is that if we have to be in a more intense situation, we need more recovery. And what we tend to do is think in those moments where there's a storm of some sort, that's when we don't take care of ourselves. So when you're going into a situation that's really going to require extraordinary energy, that's when you have to be more careful, not less careful, about how you recharge yourself. And, the first thing in the morning that I think about every day is that I have the chance to change my mind. And what I mean by changing my mind is not just, I'm going to decide something different, but I can literally change the way that my brain operates so that I see the world around me differently. I can literally change the way my brain operates so that I can be more present in the moment. But that all requires an intentional focus on some sort of plan that allows us to really focus on the things that are most important and take care of ourselves as if not more important, as the other resources that we have in our life.
Yeah, is the other payoff part, a subtle point that you brought up at the beginning, Heidi, was you're talking about tennis players, right? The tennis players spend about 35% of the time on the court actually playing, and the rest of the time is strategically managing their recovery and maybe visualizing the next point or whatever. But it's not actually performing at a peak level. And maybe that's that payoff. The payoff is leverage. The payoff is that if we're able to do this, then we're really taking our time and maximizing its utility, where we can get a 35% kind of payoff as well, right? We're using less of our time to operate at a really, really high level.
Absolutely. And of course, the challenge for those of us who are entrepreneurs is we automatically go, okay, great. Well, then I can get more stuff done. So we have to be careful not to get pulled into, this notion that it's all about how much we get done or how hard we work. It's really about this yin and yang, this push and pull, this stress and recovery of maximizing our ability to be in those moments, knowing that we have to limit the number of moments we have in order to be at our best. So it really takes intentionally reminding ourselves that in order to speed up, we have to slow down. There has to be a rhythm, because you could follow this sort of a program and have really high levels of energy and engagement and productivity and still burn out because you're still ramped up too high. Now you're doing all of these things better, but you're still not stopping and pausing and pulling that back in. And I think that's something we just really have to talk a lot more about, is the tendency of high achievers and entrepreneurs to burn out physically, emotionally, mentally, spiritually, socially, because they're trying to sustain such high levels over a long period of time.
Yeah, and I think that part of that for us is, as entrepreneurs, and leaders is it's difficult to be vulnerable. It's difficult to go to someone and say, "Hey, I'm having a problem.
Yeah.
My energy level. It's maybe some of us perceive it as weakness. Maybe some of us perceive it as a failure, even to admit
Right.
that we're having a hard time. But it's really not that at all.
It's not a weakness, and something has happened. I'm noticing this more and more as I kind of reflect on all of this, that we have increased the demands on the human energy system to such outrageous levels that the fact that we're all still keeping up is amazing to me. This is truly a 24/7 opportunity to be on and work. And I don't know many people who aren't striving and finding success, who aren't thinking about it almost all the time. So, back in the day, there were oscillations naturally, just because, even before we had lights and electricity, it sounds so long ago, but it wasn't that long ago. And we're still really designed physiologically to have this cycle of day and night and off and on. And, even from the point that it was just our parents' generation that didn't have personal computers. So when they came home from work and the family had dinner, it was either dinner or the TV. There was no taking work home with you the way that it is now. And now it's not only accepted, it's expected. So that level of energy, that nonstop energy expenditure is really toxic. And I think we're going to see more and more issues with that as we see more and more people dealing with mental illness and burnout and exhaustion. And, I think ultimately it's the majority of it is a mismanagement of energy. So we've got to take responsibility for it and see it not as a sign of weakness, but as a strategic business initiative that if we can manage this more effectively, we can show up more in the moments that matter most, and we can be around for a longer time period in order to enjoy, what it is that we're working so hard at, and essentially have an effect on our community, which I know everybody, in EO that you and I have worked with really has a passion for building a legacy. Well, you got to be around long enough to actually do that. We got to manage our energy.
And one of the ways that we can do that right now, really, when you talk about this idea of community, is that as leaders, if we not only manage our own pitch counts and lead by example, we can coach our teams into managing their pitch counts, get more out of them, and be more impactful in that way right away, right?
Absolutely.
It's great to be impactful in the world, but if we can be impactful in our world right now, that's even better.
And not only are you impacting those people that you're at work with, but you're impacting their families because you're changing their wiring and you're changing their energy holistically. It's not just who they are at work, it's who they are all the time. So when people start paying attention and they decrease multitasking and they take responsibility for the energy that they bring to each moment, it changes who they are. And now you start to rewire our habits of attention. And I think it's really special. And it's the last chapter of the book that I'm writing now, which is how do we create a recharge revolution? How do we actually encourage everyone to be responsible for the energy that they bring? How do we decrease multitasking and distraction? How do we make sure that, when you're talking to someone, I love that you have the video and the audio here because it allows us to see the other person's really following along with me. And how many moments in our day are we giving time and energy we're not even sure if the other person's really present? I think that there's a big shift that needs to happen. And the good thing is it's a win-win across all areas. Our health will be better. Our happiness will be better. Our relationships will be better. Our business will be better. It is not a if this, then that. Like it's not I have to be good at work or good at home. It's really changing the way we operate so that we're better at both of those.
Amazing. Heidi, I know that I could keep you on for another half an hour, but our time
up.
But I'm hoping we can do this again. Though we didn't devise another paper napkin right now, I'm hoping we can do this again. Will you come back?
I would love to come back, and I have even more ideas because I think that the next step is, okay, how do we do it? Like, let's make it tangible. Let's really figure out, what are the recommendations, what works? Because the one thing I'm learning is you're not going to come up with your recharge toolbox when you're exhausted. You've got to do it ahead of time. So putting that together so that when you are ready to recharge, you have it handy. It's going to be really important.
Yeah, that's fantastic. Thanks again, Heidi.
Okay, thank you.
Hey, if you liked that episode, there's a ton more like it on iTunes. Just search Paper Napkin Wisdom. Go to papernapkinwisdom.com to find the blog and pictures of all of the paper napkins. Plus, you can also follow along on Facebook, find Paper Napkin Wisdom on Twitter @WiseNapkin. My name is Govind Jayaraman. This is Paper Napkin Wisdom. Thanks for watching. Make it a great day.